Blessed is the person who was given the ability to reflect, seek truth, and come back to themselves, so that even when they're surrounded by inherited conditions, those conditions don't get to define who they are, how they feel, or where their authority comes from. I've been on this introspective journey for a while now. I did all the inner work, shadow work, healing, sovereignty, and I thought I was done. I do this because I used to feel like I didn't have control over my life. And the last thing I thought about was if I even had control over myself, until I realized that I do. That's why I'm so big on sovereignty. This isn't a trend for me. This is my life. Right now, I feel sovereign. I know who I am. I know whose I am, God, the Creator. I know what I care about. I am me, and no one can take that away from me. I healed. I really grew up. I've discovered so much about myself. But recently, I hit a new level of awareness that's different from all the other work I've done. This time, through reading about systemic and psychological realities, I realized that a huge portion of the suffering that I'm still carrying regardless of healing, regardless of being strong-willed and devoted and rebellious, these burdens still try to keep me down. Every day, it's a fight to not fall victim to them. I came to one conclusion: something I haven't heard in a podcast, read in a book, or seen as a quote. Almost all of the bullshit I'm dealing with has absolutely nothing to do with me. It's the recognition of what's inherited versus what's innate. And once I saw that distinction, I stopped emotionally carrying burdens that were never mine to begin with. Blessing was capacity. When I think about the word blessed, I don't think about luck or some kind of cosmic protection plan. My life hasn't been smooth. If anything, the last few years showed me exactly how fast things can fall apart, even when you've done everything right. But blessing showed up anyway, just not where I expected it. It showed up as the capacity to see, the ability to step back and look at what was happening instead of just drowning in it, to pause and reflect instead of reactively spiraling, to ask, what is this? Without immediately making it mean something permanent about who I am. That capacity to reflect, to seek truth, to come back to myself, that's innate. It's not something I built or earned. It's something I was born with, a core configuration that stayed intact even when everything around me fell apart. That's what kept me from completely losing myself when my life felt like it was sliding off the rails, financially, structurally, emotionally. The chaos was real, but it didn't become my identity. Even when everything external was unstable, something in me stayed put. I could still observe. I could still question. I could still come back to myself even after reacting or breaking down. And that awareness, the ability to recognize what's mine and what isn't, what's innate and what's inherited, that's what led me to this realization in the first place. Blessing isn't a life without disruption. It's an inner structure that can hold you through it. When I stopped referencing myself, for a long time, I moved through life like I didn't have any of that internal capacity at all. Not on purpose, but functionally. I was making decisions, carrying worry, organizing my entire sense of self around my circumstances. Like whatever was happening around me had the final say on who I was and where I was going. I let external conditions run my inner world. My fears, my self-assessment, the way I moved through the world, all of it was quietly shaped by what I'd inherited instead of what was actually true about me. And these inherited narratives were sneaky. They didn't show up like beliefs I had to agree with. They showed up as assumptions I didn't even notice. That stability equals worth. That struggle equals personal failure. That losing control, losing yourself, that external collapse equals internal deficiency. I never consciously chose any of that. I absorbed it from my environment, from systems I was born into, from survival logic, from the quiet pressure to adapt. Here's the contradiction. Internally, I had depth. I could reflect. I could sense when something wasn't mine. I had an internal compass. But externally, I was moving like none of that counted. That's how inherited narratives work. You don't have to believe them for them to shape you. You just have to let them narrate your life. I was confusing my conditions with my identity, treating pressure like it was wisdom, carrying weight that was never mine and calling it responsibility. Living like blessing was something I'd lost, instead of something I'd just stopped referencing. What I inherited versus what's actually mine. One of the most important things I figured out was learning to separate what I inherited from what's innate. What I inherited came from outside, from my environment, systems, family dynamics, culture, survival conditions. It showed up as pressure before it even became a belief. I didn't choose it. I absorbed it. Scarcity, inherited. Fear around stability, inherited. The idea that struggle means I'm failing, inherited. The belief that my worth is conditional, that I have to earn it through control or productivity or keeping everything together, inherited. None of that originated in me. It was a response to structures I was born into. Over time, it got internalized, not because it was true, but because it kept getting repeated. What's innate was quieter, older. Innate is the underlying orientation that was there before I had to adapt, before I had to survive, before external narratives got hold of me. It's what stays even when it's hard to access. It's the core configuration underneath everything I've learned, everything that's been imposed, everything I've been required to be. My capacity to reflect, innate. My natural talents, my expressions, innate. My ability to step back and observe, innate. My instinct to look for meaning instead of collapsing into reaction, innate. My actual values, innate. That internal compass that kept pointing inward when nothing else made sense, innate. It's who I am underneath everything that tried to name me otherwise. Even when I was overwhelmed, even when I doubted everything, even when I temporarily identified with fear or shame, those capacities didn't disappear. They didn't need permission. They were there long before I had words for them. The confusion came from mistaking what I inherited for who I am. When I didn't examine that inherited pressure, it felt personal. It felt like something was wrong with me. And once I identified with it, my emotional life started responding like those conditions were truths about me instead of just circumstances I was experiencing. The moment I learned to separate the two, what came from outside versus what's always been in me, something loosened. I didn't have to reject my experiences or pretend reality wasn't real. I just stopped letting inherited conditions speak for my essence. What's innate doesn't disappear under pressure. What's inherited dissolves under clarity. When I started identifying with what I inherited, once my identity collapsed into inheritance, my emotional life followed. Emotions stopped being signals and became where I lived. Fear hardened into anxiety. Frustration settled into resentment. Uncertainty became shame. And from that emotional state, I made decisions. My choices became reactive instead of rooted. Life became about managing pressure instead of expressing truth. I started prioritizing what felt urgent over what was actually essential, what I thought I cared about. Control, validation, security, escape was often just a reaction to inherited stress, not a reflection of who I actually was. That's the danger. It didn't just distract me. It convinced me that the distraction was me. Misplaced authority. One thing about my journey: God, my creator, will always tell me exactly what I need to know when I need to know it. Like I mentioned, I'd been reading books from the library that led to this deconstruction. And while this was happening, life was lifing. So I picked up the Bible. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed wisdom, something older than my confusion. Randomly, I landed on Psalm 1. Now, one thing you should know about me: I like reading religious texts through symbolism and layers. I don't take everything literally. I look for the deeper meaning, the patterns, the truths that apply beyond the surface story. Like how I read the parable of the prodigal son in the Prodigal Self article. It wasn't just as a story about a wayward child for me. It was also a metaphor for returning to yourself. So when I read Psalm 1, I wasn't just reading it as doctrine. I was looking for what it was saying beneath the words. Here's what it says: Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. I'd read it before, but this time something clicked. I'd always thought walking in step with the wicked, or standing in the way that sinners take, meant doing something morally wrong, being bad, rebelling. But this time, I had a different interpretation of it. For me, it was talking about where you take direction from. The wicked, the sinners, the mockers, they're not evil people. They're misguided orientations, external voices, accumulated noise. It's the systems, fears, expectations, inherited beliefs, survival logic, the things that quietly tell you who you are and how life works. Walking in that counsel just means you're moving through life guided by interpretations that were never rooted in who you actually are. And I realized that's exactly what I'd been doing. I was treating circumstances as identity, treating pressure as truth, mistaking fear for wisdom, letting systems, scarcity, comparison narrate my inner life. I didn't consciously agree with any of it. I just absorbed it by living inside it long enough. What made this counsel ungodly wasn't that it was sinful. It's that it was disconnected from source, from essence, from the internal reference point that lets you tell the difference between what's happening to you and what's true about you. And then the psalm says, "Whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night." To me, that's not just about religious rules. It's about returning to a deeper order, to truth, to knowledge, to an internal reference point that isn't dictated by urgency or fear, to God, my Creator. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Rooted, nourished from within, not dependent on external conditions to stay intact. And then, not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. No root, no weight, just reaction. I'd been living like I was making realistic, responsible choices. But really, my identity was eroding. My decisions were reactive. My life had become about threat management instead of truth expression. And the wildest part, it didn't announce itself as distortion. It showed up as common sense. Once I saw that, once I realized the voice guiding me wasn't for me, as well as not for me, I didn't have to fight it. I just stopped walking in that direction. When I had no root, for a long time, I lived without an internal anchor. And I know now that this is what happens when you organize your life around inherited narratives instead of innate truth. When you let external authority run your inner world. I didn't have a center of gravity. My sense of self shifted with circumstances. My direction changed based on fear, urgency, comparison, loss. Whatever pushed hardest in the moment decided where I moved next. That kind of life felt busy, exhausting. There was a lot of motion, but no real weight, no cohesion, no continuity. This is the opposite of sovereignty. I'd done so much work to reclaim control over myself, to remember who I was, to build inner authority. But without being rooted in what's actually mine, without distinguishing innate from inherited, I was still being blown around, like chaff. And when life demanded clarity, when decisions needed to be made, when things had to be examined honestly, when truth couldn't be avoided, I couldn't hold my ground. Not because I was being punished, but because there was nothing solid underneath me. The patterns I'd built, shaped by fear, scarcity, inherited distortion, they didn't last because they were never grounded in anything real. They only existed as long as I believed them. And when clarity returned, when I reconnected with what was actually mine, that false authority lost its grip. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was complete. What once felt powerful just stopped working, loosening its hold, losing its authority, dissolving on its own. And then I remembered who the fuck I am. There was a moment where I was being dragged by fear, instability, inherited narratives, emotional reactions that didn't even belong to me. For a second, I forgot who I was. And then I remembered who the fuck I am. That was the shift. I'm not my circumstances. I'm not my reactions. I'm not the pressure I was living under, even when things felt completely out of control externally. I still had access to something internal. And once I remembered that, I stopped making decisions from what I'd inherited and started making them from what was innate. That didn't come from toxic positivity or pretending everything was fine. It came from seeking clarity. I started asking better questions. I turned toward knowledge, understanding, truth, not to escape the situation, but to orient myself inside it. And what I realized was simple, but it changed everything. The things that felt like they were breaking me weren't me. They were conditions I'd been living inside of, not definitions of who I am. The closest way I can describe it. It's like realizing there have been uninvited guests in your house for a long time. You've lived with them so long you stopped noticing. You rearranged yourself around them. You adjusted your emotions, your expectations, your sense of self, never once realizing that this is your house. And the wildest part, you don't even realize you have the authority to remove them until the moment you actually do. Like squatters, they were never invited. They don't belong, but they stay as long as you don't kick them out. That realization, this is my house, changed everything. Living from what's innate means returning to that place, where meaning isn't dictated by pressure, where identity isn't negotiated with circumstances, where clarity replaces noise. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about stripping away what never belonged and letting what's already there lead again. That's what kept me intact when everything else felt unstable. And that's why the blessing wasn't external. It was the ability to remember myself before I lost myself completely. Returning to inner order. At some point, awareness isn't enough. Living from what's innate requires orientation. You have to decide what you return to when life demands meaning from you. For me, that return looks like clarity, understanding, truth-seeking, not in some rigid, dogmatic way, but as a grounding thing. When things feel unstable, when emotions get loud, when circumstances press in, I keep coming back to a deeper order, to knowledge, to reflection, to an internal reference point that isn't dictated by urgency or fear. That's the difference between living from something that sustains you and living from something that constantly reacts. When I live this way, my inner life stops being ruled by the weather of my circumstances. I'm not dependent on things being calm or predictable or resolved to stay intact. I still feel, I still respond, but I'm not uprooted every time something shifts. This kind of orientation doesn't make me invulnerable. It makes me coherent, and coherence changes everything. From this place, growth doesn't need to be forced. Things unfold when they're ready. I'm not trying to extract meaning from chaos. I'm rooted in something that already has structure. When my nourishment comes from within, from understanding, alignment, truth, I don't wither just because conditions are difficult. Dry seasons don't erase me. Delays don't mean failure. Pressure doesn't automatically mean something's wrong. I stay intact, and from that intactness, what I create, my decisions, my work, my relationships, my creativity has weight. It holds together. It doesn't cost me my identity just to sustain my life. So the real question isn't what I've been through. It's what am I rooted in when I go through it? What do I return to when meaning is required? What governs my inner life when things don't make sense? What keeps me coherent when the external world gets loud? Living from what's innate doesn't mean rejecting reality. It means refusing to let reality define my essence. It means choosing an inner order that can hold me again and again without requiring me to disappear into my circumstances. That's not spiritual bypassing. That's inner stability. And once I've felt that kind of rootedness, I don't confuse it with anything else.